everyone. I very rarely ask for audience participation, and I'll only do it once today. But if you can indulge me, if you can raise your hands if any of the following questions you want to respond in the affirmative. Hold your hands there if you can for the duration of the questions, not the duration of the talk. Which would suck. If you ever started a project and you don't know what to do next. A lot of not hands, I'm surprised. Some people have amazing abilities. If you've ever been working on a project and you've run into some creative block. Good, most hands, because otherwise I'd feel really inferior. If you've ever had a project budget go just slightly over budget. Or if you've heard any of the two following things. Like, can you jazz it up a little? Or I'll know it when I see it. Not to imply that our clients are dictators, but I think sometimes in the throes of those moments, it feels a little stressful. I somewhat dread this talk because it's so general, and I recognize that people are approaching their work from many different standpoints, but two kind of edge cases that concern me. The first is that folks have a lot of process in what they do, and everything I tell them is going to be really boring, and they're going to just watch YouTube videos of cats fighting and be very, very bored. The other case that I'm concerned about is folks who have no process in their work and think that everything is about creativity and ideas. And those people tend to think I'm a big dummy head. So somewhere in between those two kind of counterpoints, I'm going to try to provide something useful that's beneficial to as many people as possible. So I'm going to touch upon four key discussion points. First of all, why we're having problems as an industry, what designers are, I think, struggling with en masse, what design should be, what we should aspire to make it, how systems can improve what we're doing. And then I'm going to talk about this thing we call the design method and take you through one of the projects we've worked on as a bit of an example of how to implement this sort of thinking. So if I look at the problems, I think a lot of it boils down to us thinking that design and art are the same thing. And I think this is a cultural kind of construct. If you go to the bookstore and you look at where the design books are, they're right next to the art books. And really, they should probably be somewhere more like the business section. It's really that, I think that what we do is so much more closely aligned to that sort of work than to free-form creativity. And as long as we believe that we're creative people, we wait for inspiration to come from external sources. It just comes from the sky, and suddenly we have an amazing idea, and we're geniuses, and everything is okay. Similarly, we start to prize originality, because creative people love originality. And on top of that, we start taking on this attitude like we're supposed to be breaking rules. This is the best image I had for like the bad guy. The bad guy's breaking the rules. Smoking, it's bad. But all of this comes down to ego. It's weird, if I walk into any setting, I can spot the designer from a mile away. And like I'm a victim of this as well, or complicit in this. We have a uniform. For such free-thinking people, we tend to present ourselves in the same way. And we love doing smart things. Like we're like dogs. If someone pats us on the head, we're really, really happy. And so we love doing smart, creative things. And if we do them really well, we can win awards. And someday I'm going to be at a talk, and this guy's going to be there, he's going to punch me out. But I would hate to think that that's where we find our validation, is in a third party telling us what we did was awesome, and here's a trophy. All of this boils down to confusing what it is we're supposed to be doing. So quite often I think we look at design as something that's for us. It's to build our book. It's so that we get to do work we're passionate about. So we're also very passionate. And when we start doing this, we build artifacts. We build beautiful objects that we can kind of show off as testament to what we do, when in fact, what we should be concentrating on is how to make stuff work. Because this is one of like the biggest points of frustration I have, is that I can't fill my gas tank without reading instructions and thinking about that interface every single time. But I do love the person who couldn't find the start button. You know, like of all the things they got lost on, why was it that? I get screwed up on where to put my credit card. So if that's what design isn't, let's talk about what design is. And I believe primarily it's a very practical, utilitarian kind of thing. And it's one in which form and function are both important, but form has to follow function. We need it to do something first before we worry about how it looks. Similarly, it's a spot where wildly creative things should probably take the back seat to more sober, restrained kind of thinking. It's funny because if we look at these two typefaces, there's one that I think we can identify for what era it came up in, and it's actually, I believe, 25 years newer than the example on the right-hand side. I think it's about finding problems and elegant solutions to them. So this is a Canadian banknote, because some people apparently use this printed money thing still. Those who are visually impaired find Braille on it so they can actually identify the banknote that they're utilizing. It's funny, we talk so much as creative people about what matters to us and what we're passionate about and what excites us that I think we forget that it's a job. And this kind of bugs me because when we don't talk about it as a job, other people don't want to treat it like a job either. I so want to be Stefan Sagmeister because his life looks so awesome. He makes awesome stuff. It looks like fun. People love him. I want to be Stefan Sagmeister. Unfortunately, I'm really incredibly boring. Not one iota of what I do has anything to do with what Sagmeister gets to do. Instead, I write a ton of email. I prep a lot of spreadsheets, and I draw a lot of boxes with X's in them and lines around. That's like my sketchbook is, if in like a million years the only artifact left from humanity at this stage is my sketchbook, we're going to confuse a lot of people. I think a designer's role is really much like an editor, and when I do my job well, I take away the stuff that's getting in the way of my client's message, and I help them make their presentation more obvious to their audience. And when we do these things well, we end up with things like IA Writer. And for any of you who write, who haven't tried IA Writer, even the current version, which is kind of perplexing, is still such a huge advancement from where Word was. If you think about that, we used Word and all its hateful, horrible awfulness for like years. And it took IA to come along and just make a writing tool that was not hateful to utilize. I know we can make a slide work here. So I think it boils down to an effort to achieve some kind of clarity. And clarity is really important to me because I'm that freaky person who has to determine where everything in my bathroom goes so that it's at its most efficient, which my spouse, who does not think at all in that way, thinks is really, really weird. But this all comes down to systems. And I think systems are a huge part of what we do. The reason I love systems so much is that design is such an ugly pursuit, and part of that is all the questions. We have this enormous number of questions that we face on every project, and if we answer them in the wrong order, we tend to make bad decisions. Similarly, we're asked to do so many things and build design that works in so many different settings that you often see the limitation of not putting systems thinking into your work, where you build something that works really well as an ad campaign, but has no ability to move over to anything else that you're working on. I think one of the other things that we really struggle with is, now there are a few of you who maybe are old enough to remember this, but there is a time in history, I know it's going to seem strange, where this was like the coolest thing in the world. Like, I think Brett's hair was even his own. This stuff doesn't look ridiculous when it happens. And we have trends right now that are happening that we're all buying into, and not because they're necessarily good things to be doing, but rather because we can't determine necessarily what's cool and interesting versus what's actually a functional upgrade in how we approach our projects. So systems help us get around that, and I think systems should really be synonymous with design. In my world, they certainly are. If I can figure out the structure of a thing, then building it is easy. So when I'm talking about systems, I'm talking about organizational systems like content inventories, which I think are just the greatest thing in the world. I'm talking about visual systems and iconography and so on that build kind of visual cohesiveness. But I'm also talking about the stuff that happens when we leave the room. So we build, let's say a website. We help with content, shape that, and get that to launch. But at that point, the client has to take it and do something with it. And if we can build the systems that they can actually take that from handoff and make use of the tools we've built, then we've designed an effective tool for them. So I've got a few examples from other groups that I think are great ways of representing how systems afford certain freedoms and benefits. First of all, they're really adaptable. This is Bruce Mao's work for the Ontario College of Art and Design. The kind of bones of this thing are so simple and so adaptable that they're allowed to put different things in place, and the identity system can grow with time, and it's not locked into one particular aesthetic. Similarly, they're scalable. If you go into a Banana Republic and you look at all of the touch points that you are interacting with, from the garments themselves, to the wood selected for the shelving, to the labels, to the packaging, to the paper, all of this somehow magically clicks together. And I think that's endemic of a really well-built system, because they're not particularly uniform decisions they're making, but they've got kind of a rule book in place for what they do so that things feel tightly aligned at all times. But also, systems are incredibly liberating. I figure like the production designer on this gig over at Apple gets like the easiest gig in the world. He or she never has to ask the question, what typeface do I use here? The system is so well worked out that that can be kind of gracefully unfolded to a lot of users, or a lot of different parties who are building. And that's a nice way of eliminating or reducing the amount of erosion you have in a project. And I don't know if any of you use this term. We use it on every project we work on that a client gets to work with later, is that it's beautiful when you launch, but depending on how well you built it, that project is going to erode because new people are going to be brought into editing that content and adding to that project, and they might not necessarily have been indoctrinated in why or how those things were being done. So I'm going to talk now about the method, and I'm going to use one particular project as an example of that. Ironically enough, it's not an interaction design project. It's a brand that has interactive elements. And the reason I do this is because I want to show you how this process works across a really big system. So the design method is built on a few different kind of core philosophies that I think are interesting. The first is that problems should be leading the way. This is a project by Deborah Adler Design, and it was for Target. I'm sure a lot of you have already seen it. It was to help, I believe, her grandmother make better sense of prescription medication because she was getting really confused by the weird labeling and such. This is like 10 years old, and it still seems like a great example of really thoughtful design. Similarly, when executed well, design should build an ecosystem, a philosophy or an ethos that's held together as a whole. And so if you look at Muji products as individual products, they're fine, self-standing, but when you put them all together, they become this beautiful kind of testament to simplicity. I'm a big fan of this Finnish design company called Iittala. These are examples of Iittala's work from over 60 years ago. And I think they look as contemporary and relevant today as they probably did the day they were launched. And I think that's another big part of the work we build, is we should be endeavoring to make design that is as timeless and long-standing as possible. So a few of the cornerstones of the method, and this is where someone in the crowd is going to go, "You're an idiot." I think we've all been lying to our clients, at least those of us who have produced 3 concepts. And I don't know where the number 3 came from, but somehow that became the magic number for when you presented creative work. You'd go into a group, and you'd put these 3 things on the table, and you'd treat them all like they were equal. But it was a big lie, because what you had really done is sweat on one thing, and then varied the background in the other 2, hoping they wouldn't notice that they were just bad kind of derivative works. And so I think that's a really bad way of working, because what tends to happen is the client can't see those as independent things, even in the best case scenario. So what they tend to do instead is look at all 3 and they go, I like that part there and that part there and that part there. Let's put them all together. And we call that Frankensteining, because what comes out is never pretty. So our take is that instead of providing 3 different things, it's more like we're going on a trip and we need to pick a destination. and we need to move towards that destination and correct course along the way, but we're not so foolish as to thinking that we can drive to 3 separate destinations concurrently. Because a similar kind of notion is that this work should be produced in a funnel-like fashion in which the big, broad questions are asked at the beginning, which is really important because think of how many times you've been in a meeting and you present the creative and the CEO shows up for the first time and asks whether this is on brand and strategically aligned. Like that's happened to me a surprising number of times. And that's the wrong time for those questions. Yes, the big stuff at the top, you narrow and increasingly get granular with your questions so that at the end you're working at typeface level and logo size and all that sort of stuff. But those are the last things you're figuring out once you know what you need to achieve. If I ask most people who do creative things where their ideas come from, how they go about their process, especially agencies, the common language is everything starts with a sketch, or everything starts with the idea. And I think that's total nonsense. If you start with a sketch, you're relying on your brilliance to drive the project, and my hunch is that few of us are as brilliant as we would like to be. If instead you start with planning, and you do a lot of planning, by the point that you actually get to that sketch, you'll be doing much more targeted and appropriate work. 2 last points to make here. First of all, every answer to why you made a decision has to be defensible. Has to have a reason behind it. I chose a serif typeface because it felt nicer to read in this setting. I chose a mega menu navigation system because we have a lot of links and we need people to be able to access them quickly. I chose a distorted photographic treatment because I wanted kind of a very otherworldly feel. What you can't ever do, in my opinion, is go, I don't know, it just felt good. It just felt right. I don't think that's a legitimate answer. And I feel foolish saying that in front of all of you, but I'm surprised by how often that is the response. I met with a group of students once, and there was a funny thing in the side of this letterhead the person had designed. It was a little red cross, and I said, so does that mean help or support or aid, or what's the reference? And the designer responded, well, it just seemed creative to me. Like, you don't ever say that. Like, that's never an answer you can actually justify to a client. Additionally, I think this idea of siloing work and presenting it beautifully at this one magic moment, I'll talk about this more in a while, is a really flawed construct. I think instead what we have to do is produce work and get the client involved as early as we can and keep that dialogue going frequently so that we both build a stronger relationship and that we learn what will and will not work on their end quickly so we don't end up too far down the wrong road. So this method is something we developed over at Smash Lab, and it came from the idea that, and this is not Smash Lab incidentally, from the idea, and this is a weird thing because people get upset because they like messy desks, but I feel that order cannot be produced in a chaotic environment. And more specifically, if we're trying to build systems of organization for our clients and structure, we better have structure in how we do that, or else we're approaching things in a haphazard fashion. So over the years, we kept kind of codifying how to structure folders and how to work clients through the process so that we could build the same means of working on every project. Even if it varied, we needed to know that the client could expect certain things to happen in a certain order. And I never thought much about that until giving a quick talk on design process in Mexico, and in preparing the slides, a young designer at our firm at the time said to me, I wish I would have learned this stuff at design school. And I was kind of weirded out by that because I took one design class in art school. I was a painting major. And I said, yeah, but this is like the basics, right? Like, you must have learned all this. And he said, no, we didn't talk about any of this. So that's what precipitated the book and 6 months of my life being absorbed and pooped away. The design method boils down to 4 stages. The first is discovery. If you don't know what you're doing for whom, you're not going to do very good work. Once you know who this is and what they're working within and so on, you can get on to planning. From there, you can move into creative, and finally, you move into application. And these are really big, broad buckets. the way that you approach them in your own work is going to vary whether you're working in a startup or in a studio for clients or in an internal department. But generally for us, the kind of key working stages break down something like this. What's interesting is if you think about how far in the process all the visual stuff comes. So I'm going to break down each of these in detail. A group that we've worked with called Open Road, they're a web development shop as well. They have a product called Thought Farmer, and Thought Farmer is an intranet solution. I'm not a real intranet guy, but they asked us to come in and help them build a system that they could use to grow because they were getting a fair bit of interest, but they didn't have enough differentiation. So they're nice enough to let me use their examples for most of this presentation, which is nice. I think the first thing you've got to do on a project is start with research, and we pay great lip service to research, but I don't think many of us do it very well. The way to do good research is to stop confusing expertise with knowledge. So I would say in this room, a large number of us are experts in design. And that feels weird to say. I don't like calling myself an expert because it seems kind of arrogant. But really after a couple of decades of doing this work, you probably should be pretty much at expert level at it. What I don't have is knowledge. Let's say, someone's coming to us for branding a projection company, or building a website for managing conference environments, or a carpet company comes to us needing to build better point-of-sale systems. Those are all worlds that I have zero knowledge in. And so it's my job to investigate, to kind of put on the closest I come to my Sherlock Holmes hat and try to figure out what they're doing so I understand their situation. So this starts with collecting data. There's a lot you can do on a peripheral level. You can start looking at blogs, reading through your client's content, which is funny. We jump to sketches, but we don't want to read the stuff that our clients have done because that somehow is getting in the way of our creativity. But in fact, if you actually click through every page of their website and skim everything, you'll have a real sense for who you're working for. Similarly, getting them to hand over any sales decks, any presentations, any brochures is a really great way of getting a very good handle on what they're doing and conducting an informal survey on where there are gaps between their goals and what they're actually doing. If you can get a hold of the business plans, brand strategies, any of that stuff that exists, that's huge because that gives you that high-level picture of what's supposed to be achieved here. And I take copious amounts of notes. I do this physically when I'm in a meeting with a client, but additionally I keep a lot of email documents open where I'm just continually noting anything that I'm spotting, any issues, any questions, any possibilities, any holes in the presentation. And what's really awesome with this is that when it comes down to presenting documentation, I can often kind of cut and paste a lot of my early notes and save myself a lot of time. Conversations are really useful, and conversations with many people in an organization are helpful. So while you want to chat with the people who are on a management level and the stakeholders in the project, you also want to talk to those people who are front-end, dealing with people every day or utilizing these tools every day to find out what they're experiencing, because the gap between what management thinks is happening or wants to have happen and what's actually happening at an applied level are often quite different. And in that gap, you can often find observations that are very useful. Similarly, the discussions you have with actual users, even quick phone conversations with a half dozen people are enough to understand what people are experiencing and where there might be gaps. One thing to look out for is the gap between what people say and what they're telling you visually. I often think that people present what they aspire towards as opposed to who they really are, kind of like dating profiles. Online dating profiles, everybody walks on the beach and has a great sense of humor, but I can tell you for a fact that not that many people have that great of a sense of humor. That gap between aspirations and actuality is often quite different, or quite great. So if you can watch for what people are doing when they're saying things, any conflicts in that presentation, often you can uncover insights that are useful. I can make a slide happen. Additionally, you have to use the stuff. And I use a roller coaster as an example of this because I can tell you all about being on a roller coaster, but until you've actually gone on one, my words don't really mean much. So if you're working with the zoo, go to the zoo and see the animals and buy a ticket like anyone else would do and see what that experience is like. If it's software, use the software and see what it's like. Fundamentally, what you need to do is get yourself in the user's mindset as quickly as possible. And once you really know what your client's about, you can go on to everyone else. I don't like starting with the competition, though. If you start with the competition, you tend to start imitating. But once you get to this stage, you know who your client is, you know what they kind of are trying to do, and you can look at what everyone else is doing. And the intranet space is interesting because it seems all built for aging white men with gray hair who want to be cool. And my favorite part of this is in kind of that middle quadrant or middle section is the how you can be an intranet rock star. Now, I don't know about you guys, but like when I grew up, I kind of wanted to be a rock star. But it never occurred to me I could be an intranet rock star, which sounds very wonderful. Simple audits, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, that sort of thing are very useful for finding out whether the view you have of the client situation is in fact what they're experiencing right now. And this research is such a drag when you start. I always hate doing it, but I'm surprised by how much I learned through that process. And even the vernacular that the client is using to be able to go and speak their language is wonderful. But most importantly, while people are looking for external things to give them inspiration and ideas, I think that's a really tenuous way to build your professional practice. If instead you go to your client and you find out what they're facing and you uncover their problems, if you can solve those problems, that's where all of your creativity lies. So now that we know who we're working with, we can start to plan. And I think designers are odd in that they don't really want to do the planning because that seems like a strategist's work. Personally, I always thought an MBA should do that kind of stuff. Why would they hire a creative people to do that? But I think this comes down to changing the role of the designer from the stylist to a big thinker. And I don't mean this in a lofty way. I mean in a really applied way that if a client comes to you, they're probably not asking you just to change the color. Anybody could change the color. What they're probably looking for is for you to reduce some kind of friction or some problem, like they can't sell enough product or people don't understand what they do or something like this tends to be at the root of those things. And if you can help them through that, you immediately separate yourself from what is an army of designers working on 99 designs or on Fiverr who are willing to commoditize this work to the very bottom of the very bottom price point. So there are a few key planning elements that I think need to start everything. Again, these are sort of obvious. You need to outline goals, and you need to work out objectives. Goals are funny because we tend to use these two terms interchangeably, goals and objectives, but they're quite different. Goals are kind of what this organization wants to achieve out there. This is where they're hoping to get to. This is aspirational stuff. You're probably not going to hit all of their goals. You might move them a little closer to them. Objectives, on the other hand, are fixed, essentially like deliverables for the project. By completing this work, we will do X, Y, and Z. So they're very different things. One you can really kind of be measured on the success of. The other is going to be a longer-term thing. Similarly, you have strategy and planning. And strategy is more of a, this is what we think we're going to do to help you achieve your goals. Whereas the planning comes down to those very granular steps. So strategy is more apt to change, whereas planning becomes a lot more kind of tactical and step-by-step. So a few useful planning tools, and a lot of you probably use these already, so I'm going to go really quickly. Personas, even for basic projects, are very important. Even if you're producing blog content, you should know who you're writing to. And the problem with not using personas is you tend to create for yourself. So when we worked on the site for the aquarium, I thought it was really for visitors to this facility to buy tickets. But it turned out it was actually for educators who needed to figure out where to get materials for their students. It was for kids who were looking at doing research on otters for a report. It was for tourists who had limited English skills, who needed to quickly find locations. There were over 14 different key persona types because the organization was so varied. That thinking about who's using this stuff is really, really critical. With that knowledge in mind, you can now start to build out use cases, scenarios, stories, these sorts of things to understand what are people doing with the stuff I'm building. We build a lot of user flows, even this is for a campaign, to understand where are people coming from, where are they going, how do we re-engage them, what tools do we need in place when they do that. And of course, the fun stuff like sitemaps and wireframes and content inventories and content strategies and creative briefs are all big planning tools. Now, what I think is interesting is that when I started doing this work, I could get away without doing almost all of those things. And I think this is endemic of how interaction design has changed everything we're doing. We now know that building some interesting thing that's cool and different isn't acceptable. It actually has to serve a functional purpose. And these interaction design tools can be applied to brand projects or campaigns or really anything to help clarify our thinking and make sure we're on target. So when you present your plan, you can do this in like a PowerPoint deck or a Keynote deck or what have you. Essentially what you're trying to do is get your planning structured in a fashion that allows your client to see that you understand their situation and that you're able to mirror what they've told you. And it's funny how just being able to say back to your client what they said to you initially creates this amazing amount of kind of comfort that you're not just flying by the seat of your pants and forgetting about their needs. What will amaze you is the response you get from your clients. All of a sudden, you've elevated yourself from being the person who brings in the Pantone swatches to someone who's having these big strategic discussions, and you can really build a strong partnership where the folks you're working with understand you're looking to solve their problems, not just apply a style. So from there, we can move on to creative. And I really have a problem with advertising and how advertising agencies approach creative work. So all of you in ad agencies probably hate me now, but I think agencies have a really fundamental problem in how they present creative. And it's because agencies have a lot of showmanship to them. And part of that showmanship is the idea of being magicians. They have this kind of hidden box they work within that no one else gets access to. And they send all the creative people into that box where they sweat and they throw papers and balls on the floor and they drink a lot, I think, because that's what Mad Men told me. And then at the end of all of this, they come up with this amazing gem of an idea that they had to toil to get to. And then what they do is they come to a meeting where they present it and they wow the client. And the client stands up and goes, "You are amazing! Take all of my money forever because you are amazing!" And the only place I've ever seen this work is the carousel pitch. The carousel pitch was the only place where I went like, wow, I want to be Don Draper too. He gets all the girls, he drinks all the time, everybody likes him. But in reality, this doesn't work. In reality, what happens is you're surprising a client. And in my experience, clients hate surprises. When you come in and you take these hundreds of hours of work and present it to them, and they decide they don't like it and they feel uncomfortable, everyone in the room gets tense, and now all the pressure builds up. And worse than that, you have to go back to the office and tell everyone that the idea they toiled over gets thrown away and you start again. And even better yet, you get to throw away the 300 hours that you already worked on the project. And I've done this, and it's painful, and it sucks. So if we approach it entirely differently, and we say we're not supposed to be geniuses, we're like tailors. We are trying to build things for our clients that fit them and make them appear more themselves. That becomes a lot easier to achieve. That allows us to get the client in the mix earlier and produce something that they're actually expecting as opposed to some huge surprise that's supposed to knock them off their seats. And I think all of this comes down to being appropriate. When we're looking for inspiration, we're looking for something external to come in and build something amazing that's never been seen. And clients overwhelmingly are not asking for that. And I use the term clients really liberally here. I do mostly client-driven work. But if you're in an internal team, you have the same thing. Your client is your boss, or your manager, or your direct supervisor. Clients want to be involved in this discussion, and they want things that are not going to get them fired or bankrupt their company. They would much rather that than that you push the bounds of design. So there are three pieces of this. There's tone, there's a concept, and there's design direction. And I'll show you each of those reasonably quickly here. Tone is established, in our studio at least, with 3 words. More than that, and it gets carried away. Less than that, it's typically not kind of full enough. And if we can pin down these 3 words, we spend a lot of time on them, we can figure out what we want this brand to feel like, or what we want this experience to feel like. For Thought Farmer, we came down to 3 words: good, accessible, and wholesome. And those are quite different from the intranet rock star and all that kind of very male, very boring kind of posturing. So when we talked about good, these terms sound similar, but they're actually kind of different in Thought Farmer's context. Talking about good, we're talking about the quality of the product. When we're talking about accessibility, we're talking about what it feels like to utilize this product. And when we're talking about wholesome, we're talking about how these people are, what it's like to work with them, what it feels like. And so often from this we can extrapolate some kind of a matrix that lets us see that those words aren't in fact really derivative or getting overly kind of close. So I don't know how well this kind of comes out here, but good, accessible, and wholesome break down to a sentence at the bottom that reads, we make great intranet software that's easy to use and we're nice people you can talk to. Which is certainly not like groundbreaking stuff, but it's really appropriate. And it makes Thought Farmer feel very distinct from the others in the marketplace. With that in mind, we can start playing with the concept. And again, I'm going to pick on ad agencies. When you're looking for an idea, which agencies tend to be in search of, you end up getting locked in something that's not that adaptable. We talk about whether a concept has legs. Can we move with it, or are we locked down? And so I dislike the notion of thinking in ideas. I like the notion of working with themes, because themes are much broader and allow us a lot more latitude. So for Thought Farmer, we came up with this broad kind of concept of healthy growth. And in this document, we explain this is the overarching kind of idea that we're playing with. This is why we think it works. This is how we'd imply, or what we'd imply through it, what we like, this sort of thing. And again, we're using a lot of words because words are easy to edit and quick, whereas visuals are typically a lot harder to produce. Once we have them agreed on those 2 points, we can get on to the design direction. And again, we don't want to start with a sketch, because sketches and building up comps takes a lot of time. And if they don't like it, you've got to go back to the start. And every time you do that, you can burn weeks of time. So you blow your project budget, you blow the timeline, and you can put your organization into financial hardship. I really like style boards for doing this. Style boards are a way of reducing the gap between what you think a word means and what your client thinks a word means. And I have Debbie to thank for this comment. This is like 10 years ago I was at a talk, and Debbie noted that when you say progressive, you think of something like really wild and progressive and so on. But your client may think that progressive means shifting from royal blue to navy blue. And that distance between the language we use is often very, very great. If we can get visuals down for our client to look at, where we outline things like type and color and use of space and all of these different things, we can very quickly see what's actually resonating with our client. And what's beautiful with this sort of thing is that the time it takes for me to produce a new set of comps is pretty substantial. The time it takes for me to swap out a few visuals in a style board is nothing. I can go back to the office, kick them out, and fire them back out in a few hours. It's no big deal. So the closer you get your client to feeling like they know what they're going to see, the better and the safer you're going to be in your operations. So from there, we got onto application. An application is kind of interesting because this is where most other people start. Most people start with, what great idea am I going to come up with to show these people how smart I am? And the design method says, no, we never do that. Instead, we're going to figure out exactly what we're doing before we pick up that pencil. And this becomes the easy part. I liken it to working in a coloring book as a kid. The line's already there, you just fill in the blanks. If we can just make this happen. You know, there's like this cognitive kind of problem where I think this thing is pointing at that, not realizing that's where the computer is. So when we're talking prototypes, I think about dumb sketches. And I'm talking about whether you're building an app, whether you're building a brand, anything. I want to make my drawing tool as crude as possible, so I cannot get obsessed with how a form field looks or how a typeface is treated or any of that stuff. What I want to do is find the crudest tool possible. And this is one example, but an even better one that I really love is painting one wall in your workspace with chalkboard paint. and then drawing everything in chalk and getting a coworker in to plan through things. And what's really nice is it's kind of liberating and freeing, and you can't get stuck in the little stuff because you're really looking at how these things work together. And you can almost essentially click through something where you can go, I'll go from this link to that link to that link. And that process can really speed along how quickly you get a sense for what this thing is that you're building. As you do this, you can get into a process of iteration. And we do these a lot with numbered versions. When you're working on creative projects, if you work in a single document, there's a real risk that you're going to forget what was good before and have an inaccurate view of what's to come. If you can version, you effectively build a history that you can look through that won't go away like Photoshop's history often does when you close the document. So what we do is we number everything with 0-0 to start. The last 0 is to indicate the internal version we're on. The first 0, or the first numeral, is to indicate which client version we're on. So after we present to the client, we go to 1.0, 1.21, 1.2, this sort of thing. And what it allows me to do is see, this is how this thing progressed, and it was better there than it was there, that sort of thing. So with these worksheets, we're typically making really ugly stuff, and we don't feel bad about it because we can't go wrong. We're just continually kind of getting closer and closer to what this thing is that we're building. And the looser you can treat this, the better. Because again, when you get really obsessed with your typographic selection or what have you, it can really kind of slow you down. And again, what happens as you go through is it gets clearer and clearer. Once you have that really locked down, you can get into production. And this is where you can become obsessive about type treatments and form sizes and all these little kind of details. With Thought Farmer, what we came down to was a seed and a line as kind of the building blocks of this entire system. We also felt that a series of textures were useful to kind of get across this natural, agrarian, wholesome kind of feel that we were looking for. And then what we did is we assembled all of these into these illustrated kind of life forms that were all self-organizing, which we felt was kind of a suitable kind of metaphor for their social intranet. We looked at growth cycles and different kind of life forms and so on, different vegetation. And then we built out things like iOS icons and word marks and things like that. A simple trick on any of these projects, if you can put the logo later in the process, it tends to not become the thing that everyone obsesses about, because for some reason, I can still go to a client and propose a major change to their business strategy, and they're fine with that. But at the end, everyone will freak out about whether that logo should be 10 pixels larger. So if you get the logo discussion out of the way, things become so much easier. We applied to things like business cards, presentation folders, letterhead, standard collateral. We built ebooks. And what's interesting is if you look at all of this, the language utilized in everything is consistent with the values and the feel of the brand as well. So the visuals and the verbal, the written language is consistent. Website, uniforms, the actual elements within the application itself. And again, any of these things, any touch point was made to feel consistent and on mark with what they were trying to do. And this is Gordon, Chris, two of the three kind of main dudes at Thought Farmer, at their presentation booth. And what's neat is they now have a creative team. And the creative director noted to me that this booth is kind of amazing because their other one, which we designed as well, is really corporate and it's quiet. Not that many people come to it. So this one is strange because wherever they set it up, people kind of flock. They want to be a part of what's going on. And this is now 4 years later. So I feel really positive about the fact that we've been able to get this mood across and a position that's very distinct from the intranet rock stars. Poor people who are the rock stars. I shouldn't pick on them like this. But the reason this method works, a few different reasons. First of all, it allocates time better. If you start with a sketch, you get into a spot where you do all of this heavy lifting and you don't know if it's actually going to work. Where what this forces you to do is do all of your big planning at the outset, get a lot of buy-in from your key stakeholders before you do any of that build. So you really are kind of structuring it up, or structuring yourself for success much more. I'm not a genius. My hunch is that there are very few geniuses in this room, but I'll bet that almost all of us think very sensibly. And if we can bring that sensible thinking to our work, I think we're going to have a much easier time working with our clients who frankly want to collaborate with us. I think it's one of the most frustrating things for clients is that their designers aren't listening to them. They don't hear what they're saying. And if you can bring them into that process and make them a part of it, all of a sudden it's not a battle. It's a collaborative effort to get to that destination. And I think that from job to job, this system works quite well. We've produced brand identity or corporate identities, marketing campaigns, websites, apps. For that matter, even when I'm working on a larger printed doc like a book, I'm using the same means of thinking through how to structure that project. And I think that's a huge thing right now is when I started, the designers were the designers. And about a month ago, I saw this project from who seemed like a kid to me. He's like 22. Who did this? He's a developer who built this product, and it was beautiful. Like, it was so well designed. And I realized design's open for everyone now. Now that people are excited about design and they value it, everybody's coming to that table to be a part of that discussion. And for all those people who want to implement design in what they're doing, the answer of, well, you've got to be talented to do that isn't acceptable. We need to find repeatable means of producing solid work. So I'm going to wrap up now. I know that we're getting kind of tight. I want to stress this is one approach. The book has such an arrogant title, The Design Method, which implies like there is no other design method. And it's total nonsense. That's what the publisher told me we had to call it to sell more copies. It really should be called A Design Method, but I don't think anybody wanted to buy A Design Method. So it's one approach. So there are things you use and things you won't. It really doesn't matter. The point is that you try to achieve clarity in the work that you're producing as opposed to originality or something self-serving. And if you do that, you're going to produce design that works, which is huge. And it's such a battle because we all want to do interesting things. And I find myself doing this over and over. I go, I've done this before. Why don't I do something really innovative? And the moment I do that, I shoot myself in the foot and I produce really crummy work. But if I pull back to what does this thing need to do? What's the simplest way to solve that problem? My stuff tends to be pretty okay, which is our tagline. Our stuff tends to be pretty okay. So again, time is limited. So if you want, the book goes into all of this in much more detail. It's a lot easier to kind of present this in long form than in a 45-minute talk. But you can always tweet at me with any questions you have, or you can just pull me aside. I'm here for a little while here, so I'm happy to chat with you. And I know there's this flood of information hitting you from so many voices, and you probably all just want to recover from your hangover and go and drink again. So I really appreciate you indulging me with this presentation this morning. Thank you so much.